My name is Cecilia Van Donselar of the Mary Isham Keith chapter of the National Society of the American Revolution. Today's day is October 20, 2020, and this interview is being conducted in Columbia Falls, Montana, for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. We are interviewing retired Major Barry E. Marsh, who served in the Vietnam War. So, Barry, would you tell us more about yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Barry E. Marsh. I'm a retired major in the United States Marine Corps. I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I was born in 5/19/1943 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm married to Annette Marie Lime Marsh. We were married in July the 3rd in 1963. She was born in Missoula, Montana on 5/27/1943. I have 2 daughters, Jeannie Marie Marsh and Sherry Marie Marsh. My stepfather's name was Lawrence H. Flatt. He was in World War II. My mother's full name is Elizabeth Marsh Butler. She was born in 1923 in Marsh Hill, Pennsylvania. I have one brother who served in the Army back in 1970s. My first tour in Vietnam, I was at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and my wife and one daughter at the time, we decided that when I got orders to go to Vietnam that she would go and live in Seattle, Washington. What happened with that is that in early 1966 I was sent to an Army school in Fort Hollywood, Maryland, called the Photo Imaging Interpretation course. It was a little over 5 months, very intense, and we learned how to interpret objects and events and things off of photography, mainly flown by the Air Force and some by the Navy, but mainly by the Air Force. And it was a whole system of going through, technical system of going through how to make these interpretations off of the photography. When I finished the school, I had orders to go to Vietnam, and one of the side effects of this was that we were new. The Marines didn't land into Vietnam until March of 1965, and of course this was in 1966, and we still a lot of learning to do. But what they decided to do was to establish in Da Nang, the city of Da Nang in South Vietnam, the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force was going to have like a support compound and walls around it, and you were secured and had air conditioning offices and air conditioning places to sleep and mess hall and dining rooms. All those kind of things were all air conditioned. And so the joke was, when I had orders about I would go to Vietnam, and I probably wouldn't hear a shot fired in anger because I was going to be in Da Nang, away from all the combat that was going on at the time. When my wife got into Seattle and got settled in, I went down to Camp Pendleton, California, and went through some training, and then eventually ended up on the USS Barrett, which was a military transport ship. And there was about 300 other Marines on that ship, and we went across and eventually ended up landing in Da Nang, South Vietnam. We debarked off of the ship, and we were standing there, and a couple of master sergeants and some other sergeants were running around calling out names and directing people where to go, different locations and whatever, and different groups of trucks were lined up, and you were numbered and go into a certain truck. Well, I just knew that I was where I was going to be in Da Nang, and I was going to go into this really cool compound and have all these neat air conditioning facilities and all this. The next thing I knew, I was the only one left standing there. And an old master sergeant come up and said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Staff Sergeant Marsh." He said, "Oh, okay, you'll go over here. Your orders have been changed. You're going to go to Phu Bai." And I said, Fubai. And I had no idea where Fubai was. I had the foggiest idea where Fubai was. So anyhow, I did what I was told. I went over and got on a truck, and they took me out to the airport, and about 40 other Marines got on the C-130, and we flew up to Fubai. Got off at Fubai, and almost the same thing. There was some sergeants running around there, and they were calling out names, and people were going different directions. A lot of those were combat guys. They were going to go to the combat units. Anyhow, I'm standing there, and the next thing I hear this old boy calling out Staff Sergeant Marsh. So I looked over, and here was a master gunnery sergeant, a little short guy. He had a little beer belly on him, and he was a character. Anyhow, long story short, he said, "You're going to go to the G2, come with me." So I went over, got in his Jeep, and we drove down to the compound and got out, and he said, "Okay," he said, "we're not sure what you need because you're the only photo interpreter in the whole 3rd Marine Division." Even though, if we go back a step, 3rd Marine Division rated 16 enlisted and 2 officers in the photo interpretation team to support a division. Well, those guys all were down in Da Nang, and for some reason they selected me to go to the 3rd Marine Division, be the only photo interpreter in the entire 3rd Marine Division. Anyhow, long story short, what happened is that we had a colonel who was the G2. He was, the intelligence guy. He was a full bird colonel. His name was Leonard C. Shepard III. Now, his dad had been commandant of the Marine Corps back in 1950. In the 50s, somewhere in the 50s. Anyhow, Colonel Shepard, for some reason, he was very bright. Probably one of the brightest guys I ever come across in the Marine Corps. He was so intelligent and so far ahead of the other staff members in the division that worked for the general. He was just had so many ideas, and some reason he took a liking to me down the road later on, another story. But anyhow, Colonel Shepard wanted his own photo interpreter. And so what happened is that they put me in this hooch, and it was nothing but wood, and the air conditioning in that was, if you pulled the sides up, you had air. If you put the sides down, you had heat. And there was nothing in that room when I walked in there the first time with this master gunnery sergeant. He just said, "What do you need?" I said, "Top." I said, I need tables. I need the lights. I need all kinds of stuff." He said, "Well, what do you really need right now to get to work?" So anyhow, I told him I needed a big table. So we ended up with sawhorses and 2 4x8 pieces of plywood, and had one light bulb hanging down, and I said, "Top, I need some more lights." Well, they went and got engineering, and they come back and they put me up 5 lights. At 5, I think they were either 80-watt or 100-watt light bulbs, and that was over my head. That was my lights. And I said, "Well, I need some equipment." And he said, "Well, okay, where are you going to get it from?" I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be down in Da Nang with the air conditioning offices and the stuff." So he said, "You need to get a hold of somebody and get that because we need to put you to work." So I made a phone call. I bumbled around here and talked to some people, made a phone call down to Da Nang, where I was supposed to be, and said, "Guys, I need super glue or glue to make my mosaics. I need stereo so I can read my photography. I need some magnifying glasses. I need all kinds of stuff." So the lieutenant that I talked to down there said, "Okay, we know you're supposed to be here, but you're up there. We're going to support you the best we can. You tell us what you need. And when we put this stuff on the C-130, I'll let you know, and you can meet the C-130 in Fubai and go from there." Fubai, what it ended up being, is headquarters for the 3rd Marine Division. And so that's where the general was, and the assistant general, and the staff officers were there, and all the support people to support a division were there at Fubai. Now, they were still building buildings and trying to get settled in, because, like I said, we hadn't been there all that long. So anyhow, long story short, I knew how to operate. I knew what my job was, so I went over to the G3, G3 is operation guys. They're the ones who say, "Okay, we're going to put a battalion in here and do a search and destroy mission here. We're going to go through this building over here, this area over here, and put another couple battalions in there and do a sweep area. We're going to try to take this hill, and this is an objective, and try to control the BC and the NVA coming into the the Northern I Corps. And the Marine Corps was responsible for what it was I Corps. It was a Northern I Corps right up to the DMZ, which divided North and South Vietnam. So long story short, I got a hold of the G3 guys and said, okay, where's our operation? And so they pointed out some places that they were going to have a battalion operations, and so I went ahead and picked that up. We had maps that were, they were old French maps that go back to the 1930s, 40s, I think. They were ancient. I mean, they didn't have a whole lot of stuff on them. So I went ahead and ordered photography. And so what I did, the 7th Air Force, through this system that we had, would fly photography for me at 20,000 feet, and they would shoot this photography, and they would go back to Da Nang and print it out, and then they would get it sent up to me, and I would have it then to do my interpretations. And so I finally got the equipment I needed about the same time I got my first roll of film, or photography, to do this first mission. Anyhow, there's tricks to how you, all kinds of different tricks how you go down and you get stereo out of your photography, and you pick out different things that on there, and you say, okay, what is that? Is that a bunker? Okay, this, you look at the map and you look at your photography and you say, okay, that road is not on there. Okay, well, that road is on here, so there's something going on here that shouldn't be on there. Maybe that was, you know, because we haven't been in there yet. So the bad guys have a road built over there. There's trails going off here. Oh, is this a bunker? Oh, okay, there's bunkers. So if we go in there as an operational area, we got bunkers to face. There's something, you know, I mean, the guys may know that we're coming, so we have to protect ourselves if we go into that area. And the Marines need to know that they're going into that area and what they may be facing, what's there. And there's a keys that they have, like if you find a truck, and so you do this little thing with a magnifying glass, it's in millimeters, now you got to change it, convert it to feet, and you did all this off of slide rules. Well, I wore out about 2.5 or 3 slide rules in my day because I used them so much. So that's how you determine. Because if you had a key and you had a truck, and that truck was 8 foot wide and 20 foot long, you took the key for the trucks and you say, okay, he's 8 foot and he's 20 foot, okay, so, all right, his cab is square, okay, well, if he's square, then you drop down to this area. Well, the front fenders are rounded, oh, okay, so you drop down to here, and you eventually come down to what that truck is actually utilized for. It may be a utility truck of some type. It may be an all general purpose truck that can handle troops and supplies or whatever. But you had to know how to break down these different elements. And when you do photography, it's interpretations. It's size and the shape and the shadow and the surrounding area are the things that you look at every piece on there, and you use those 4 elements to determine, okay, this is what this is, and this is what this could be. So that's how you make these interpretations. Well, then when you do all this interpretation off of the photography, you've got stacks of it. They're 9 inches by 18 inches, and they're black and white. This is way back now. You've got to remember what's the quality of some of this. And you end up doing what we call as a mosaic. And you build this mosaic, you lay it out, and you put this thing together. It's kind of like if you look at the Google Maps today. This is what you're going to see almost as what we was doing back in 1967. So long story short, I would make these big mosaics. And the first one I made, 5 foot by 5 foot, and this operation area that the Marines were going to go into, and I finished it up, and I used to work 20-hour days. That was just my thing. Just 20-hour days were the average. I got the mosaic put together and went up and went over and briefed the colonel. And he looked at that and said, oh, come on. You know, he grabbed me and we took off, and I didn't know what was going on. I was 23 years old, and I had no idea what was happening with all this. And we briefed the general and a couple of the staff members, and he said, holy mackerel, they thought this was the greatest thing they ever seen. And they got a Google map now in front of them with all this stuff on it, and I could make notes on there on what different things were or what I thought different things were. And so the colonel looked over at me and he said, you got to go out to the combat command and brief them. So get your gear ready. And again, I had no idea what was going on. So the top was there, the master gunnery sergeant, and he took care of it. He got me my combat gear, the helmets, the jackets, and the boots, and all those things that I needed. and a backpack and food and all this kind of stuff to get together to fly out to where the combat units were. And so I went to the first one was the regimental combat out in the western part of Vietnam. So I got on a helicopter, they flew me out there, they knew I was coming, and I landed, and I went up and I briefed. They knew I was coming, so I got a hold of the S2 officer, which was regimental, and the intel guy, and got a hold of him. He was a lieutenant, and he had a couple of sergeants and stuff working for him. We talked about what I had, this mosaic, and we compared the mosaic to the maps that we were using that was 20 years old. And I pointed out all these really neat things that, that we could now see in real life that was out there in front of us that they hadn't seen before. So the colonel, when I briefed the colonel, the regimental commander, he said, you need to go down to the battalion. He said, because the battalion that's going to go out there first, to be our lead battalion going out there, he said, you need to go brief them. So they got me down to the battalion. I briefed the battalion commander. The battalion commander then called in his company commanders. So I briefed the company commanders. The company commanders in the one company that was going to, I don't know what company now it was, that was going to be the lead company to go out on this operation, going to be the point to go into this operation area that we had never been in before. He got a hold of one of his lieutenants, platoon commander, and the platoon sergeant, got their squad leaders, and I'm briefing all these people. I'm going from generals down now to corporals and sergeants and privates and whatever, getting ready to go into this combat area and trying to show everybody what these things are in my mosaic and compare them to what they see on maps and whatever. Well, then this guy had the idea. He said, well, since we're going out there and you have this mosaic, he said, you need to be with the front guys going out. He said, you need to be out there with them. And so when we run across something, you can point these things out on your mosaic that we don't have on our maps. So I said, wait a minute. The next thing I knew, I found myself being the seventh guy in the lead squad going into a new combat area. I had no idea what was going on. I had a rifle and a pistol, and I had my mosaic, and I had my backpack with my food, and here I was with a combat unit. And I was supposed to be back in Da Nang in an air-conditioned office. And I was out here in the middle of this nowhere. And it was, I can't remember at the time, I think that was in February of 1967. I basically arrived in Da Nang, I think the end of 1966, December, got up to Phu Bai, and it took me a while to get organized so I could make these mosaics and get coordinated with the operations officers and stuff where we're going to do all these operations. So I think this is about the first part of February of 1967, and so that was the first operation I went out, and we didn't run across anything. Fortunately, I had, gosh, I didn't know it at the time, but I look back on it, years later to say, God, how lucky we were. We didn't run across any bad guys. Well, we ran out of the area that I had my mosaic on. So, it was no good anymore. So anyhow, they said, okay, you can go on back. So I worked my way back and got a helicopter that brought supplies in and flew back to Phu Bai and reported back into the colonel that I was out there, and okay, well, you did a good job. Okay, well, here's the next one. We're going to go in this operation. So I went through the same process again. I requested the photography, operation immediate photography, and went ahead, eventually got the photography, did all my interpretations again, went through that whole process, and put the mosaics together, this 5 foot by 5 foot mosaic, and briefed the colonel. The colonel said, okay, I'm going to pack you up, you're going to go out to the combat area again. So here I went. Well, this time we were out there for several days, and this is where you learn some things. You see some things you don't unsee. The first Marine that I saw that was killed, and then the first bodies we found in the NBA and the VC. you know, that we got into a hell of a deal with this operation. I was back in line again, and I told these guys there was a road. I said, you need to go high on the road. If you go low, you're going to put yourself in a bad situation. And they all knew that. I wasn't telling them anything they didn't know. I was just trying to make my interpretations real, reading off of my mosaic and what was on the maps. You could tell the elevation changes, etc. And I was trying to give them all that. And I was, you know, like I said, I was 23 years old, and I was trying to direct and guide and do my job. And of course, you know, there was always skepticism, because here I was, a division poke out there with the combat guys. You know, what was I doing out there with these combat guys? You know, I'm a division guy. I'm going to squeal about somebody or say something I shouldn't say. Anyhow, long story short, what had happened in this process, and there was a number of these that I went through, when I got to the battalion areas, they usually assigned somebody with me. Either he was an administrative guy, or he may have been part of the S2, the intelligence guy from the battalions. He may have been a runner of some type. But anyhow, there was always somebody assigned to me, because when you did foxholes at night and whatever, you always had a partner, because 99% of the time you were 50% alert. You could sleep 2 hours, the other guy stayed awake, sleep 2 hours, the other guy stayed awake, back and forth like that. So when you get into these areas, the habit came that they would assign, you know, somebody to me, you know, usually a corporal or whatever it was, lance corporal or somebody. Sometimes I had a sergeant, depending on what I was located. If I was at division, not a division area, but a regimental area, one of the sergeants in the S2 area may be, you know, he would be one of the guys that came with me instead of, because I was a staff sergeant, he would be assigned to me. But normally it was somebody assigned to me, and when we dug foxholes or set up for the night or whatever, I was married up with you know, one of those guys. And this is where you run across some things, you know, it's when you solve certain things and you learn certain things about yourself. One of the things I learned very quickly is at night, I used to be a smoker, and you know, when it got dark, the smoking lamp was out, and we didn't smoke. And so I had to put up with that. But the other thing was, at night it got so dark. I mean, we're talking dark. You couldn't even see your hand in front of you. And it affected me even to today. I cannot sleep in a dark room. I have to have a night light, or if I'm traveling, I have to leave the bathroom light on. I have to have a light somewhere in that room. If anybody ever wanted to interrogate me, all they needed to do is put me in the dark room, and I would tell them everything I ever knew, and things probably I didn't know. But that was something, you learn something about yourself, because when you're sitting on your 2-hour watch and you're listening for the bad guys, and you're hearing things, and it's so black, you can't see anything. You don't panic, but you're so tight and uptight. Even when it comes time for you to go to sleep and the other guy takes over, you're so wound up, it's hard to sleep. So you may go a day and a half, 2 or 3 days without sleeping, because you're just, at least I was, because again, I wasn't supposed to be out there. I was supposed to be back in the rear with the gear. Anyhow, I was there, long story short. So there's some things you learn about yourself, and then it's the first firefight that I got in was about the second time I went out, and we got shot up. That was scary. I mean, and every time thereafter, I don't care what anybody says, that first round that goes off, you go into panic over it, and you go into this mode of self-protection. You know, how am I protecting myself? What am I doing here? You know, what is this that okay, there's shots coming in from out there somewhere, and how many are out there? Where are they? And you've been told that, you know, to hit the ground, and you always, when you did that, if you were in the left side, you faced to the left. The other side, you faced to the right to see where the bad guys were, and you prepared yourself for that. And sometimes they were very short. I know, like my first firefight that I was in, I had an M14 rifle. I had fired that M14 rifle even before Vietnam. I was familiar with it. Did it ever hit anything? I have no idea. I just know that we shot back towards where the rounds were coming from. In a lot of cases, in those firefights, you never saw anybody. They would show up, shoot at you for a couple seconds, and be gone. And they would just melt back into the terrain. In a lot of cases, you know, by night, they were VC. I mean, they were bad guys coming after us. By day, they were farmers. They would be out in the rice paddies behind their water buffalo doing rice paddy stuff, doing gardening stuff. So it was tough sometimes, you know, when we were going through the different villages, and I would have mosaics of these villages and what was left of some of them, and then some of them, you know, were fairly new. I mean, they were not on the maps at all, but they were on my mosaics that I made. So you watched all these things going around you, and how different operations, and like I said, we were still learning. This was 1967, and we only had been there 2 years maybe at the time. And so we were learning jungle warfare tactics, how do we get into these areas and accomplish what our mission was, what our objective was, and get our Marines out of there, but get rid of the bad guys, and make sure that they weren't coming down from the north and coming into the South Vietnam. I did a lot of time laying mosaics for the DMZ, and that was the division between the North and the South. And I laid so many mosaics for the DMZ because of the operations we ran, that if a stone, I think, was overturned, I could tell you that a stone was overturned because I had read so much photography off of the DMZ, and good spots where the NVA were coming across the DMZ, coming into the south, or going, you know, coming across the western part of Vietnam and going into Cambodia, going farther south and raising hell down, you know, farther south, way down behind us. But I could tell by the photography, you know, if there's something moved, something came through there, or something had changed. I got so used to reading these, and I went out with a number of the operations in the DMZ because I could tell the commanders, you know, this has changed. There's something different out here. And I know one day in July of 1967, an NVA battalion was, and not only did I suspect it, but other intel methods had detected that there was a battalion that came into the DMZ. So we went in there to hunt them out, and it was a search and destroy mission. And holy cow, these guys were fresh. They had new weapons, they had haircuts, they had uniforms, and they were tough. We ran up against a battalion that was not going to just back off and go back across the north or go back into Cambodia where we weren't supposed to go. They were staying, and we got ourselves in a real bad situation for about 2 days. We got hurt bad. We really did. We got it handed to us, and then we learned very quickly. You know, fortunately, we had air superiority. We had aircraft that could come in and bomb the living devil out of these guys. We had Cobra gunships, and we had fast movers. You know, the jets and stuff would come in and scrape areas and drop bombs. And we had artillery. We had, you know, we had 105s and 175s. We had all that backup support. And we had to utilize it. We had to be smart enough to learn how to utilize it and when to utilize it to protect our Marines. So we were learning, and everybody was learning. I mean, the battalions were learning, and the support system was learning. You know, the logistics was learning. The aircraft, you know, covering us. You know, you don't have an aircraft that comes in and goes, you know, over you. They always go parallel in front of you when they're shooting, or they're dropping bombs, or they're going after somebody. Because if they come in over top of you, they may go short, and we ended up in several cases where some Marines and whatever got killed because they come in and did the wrong thing at the wrong time. But there's support people there that's supposed to control that, the forward observers, so they control where the aircraft come in and where they drop their bombs and what kind of support. We got involved in, I don't know, I guess people still remember some of the things called arc strike. They were B-52s, arc light, and B-52s would come in from Guam, and we would have an area mapped out for them, and they would bomb the living devil out of B-52s with 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, and they would absolutely destroy an area that we thought the bad guys were in. So instead of us going in there first and fighting these guys, we would go in and let these guys go and bomb the living devil out of an area. Arc lights for miles around would shake the ground. I mean, and they were devastating. We would go in right after we have an arc light. We would stay back far enough, and then we would find the VC and the NBA that they were concussions, and they would blow out their eardrums. You know, they were totally, I mean, it was just a mess what these arc lights would do. But we were sending our Marines in, they were still fighting, but yet, you know, they were damaged. And so we had an advantage using arc lights and other bombs and artillery to fight this thing. But as we went along, and I kept building, you know, trying to get better and better at doing mosaics and getting faster at doing mosaics. I tried to get some support out of 3MAF, out of the guys down in the compound in Da Nang, trying to send me intel stuff so I could work off of it. And when I went out to these operations, I had something else to offer. But again, my advantage was to this is I would go out and do an operation with one of the battalions, and when that operation was over with, or they ran out of my mosaic area, I could come back to the division area. And I tell you this because it's the truth. I mean, I didn't have to live out there 365 days a year. I went out there, maybe spent a week at the most, 2 weeks at the very, very most, and sometimes around 10 days, depending on what operation we were going in. And when I got out there with my information and when we were going to kick it off, weather could have effect, the number of aircraft available to bring our battalions in to do a combat operation, all that, you know, had factors. So I could get to one of the combat areas and we didn't have enough aircraft to move the troops that we needed immediately, so we'd have to back off a half a day or maybe a day before, so we'd have enough helicopters come in to pick up our troops and leapfrog them to a certain point, and then they would be in, you know, the area that I had the mosaics. But once that was over with, then, you know, I had nothing to do out there. I mean, I was not an infantry guy. I was, you know, an intel guy that came out there. So then I could catch a flight and go back to division headquarters, clean up, get a decent meal, whatever, change my clothes, and then go back and start doing, you know, operations. Where are we going to go? Where's the next operation going to be? I start making mosaics for that. It was a tough time going out there, and you know, we were in 1967. We were losing a lot of Marines, a lot of Marines. Anyhow, you never got used to that. It was always almost a sick feeling when you had an operation and you pulled back your wounded and you pulled back those who were KIA. And the body bags would stack up, and you were there with the battalion headquarters or the battalion staff or the regimental staff. You were there where that action was, and where the senior members of the battalions and the regiments were, and you would see what was coming back and being flown out, and it was devastating. You never could say, oh, well, okay, that's another one, and go on. You just had another sick feeling to your stomach. And I spent a lot of time in memorial services, because we would pull back and the Marines that were KIA, we would have a little memorial service. We'd try to have the chaplain there, or somebody would say some words or whatever, and you took a time out, if you will, and it wasn't, but very, very short period, where you thought about these young guys and what was happening to them, what they were sacrificing, for what we were supposed to be doing in Vietnam. It was I think the hardest day, and this is going to be tough. The hardest day was north of Way City. We did a sweep operation north of Way City going to the west along Highway 1, and it was a pretty good sized area. There were some old French towns that had been destroyed way back when. The villages more than towns, they were small areas where the French had been there way back when, in the 40s and the 50s, I guess. Anyhow, I was assigned a young corporal, and I had laid out this big mosaic because we were concerned about the possibility of some of the NVA coming in by boat into the shore, because this Highway 1 ran parallel to the Gulf of Tonkin, and this north again, like I said, of Way City. And we were concerned about them coming in and where they went to when they got into land. If that was the case, if they really did come in by boat, we weren't really 100% sure, but there was an increase of activity, radio activity, some other things that the radio battalions were picking up, some radio frequency things. And I laid out this big mosaic of this whole area, and I didn't find it. I think, because it was just kind of an open area where these old villages and old buildings had been blown apart. So we were moving through there early in the afternoon, noonish or so one day, and this is a tough part. I had this corporal who was assigned to me, and he was an ES2 guy. He was the intel guy. Worked for the lieutenant in the battalion, and he was in front of me and I was behind him, and we were going down by a wall. There was a concrete wall that I don't know why it was there. It might have been part of a building that got blown away or tore down, but there was a small wall. All of a sudden we got hit by a small arms fire and by the rifle-propelled grenades, RPGs. And they were a rocket that could be shot from the shoulder, and they were pretty accurate, and they came out of some wooded areas that was off to our left, and we got, the battalion headquarters is what got hit. The companies had swept through, one of the companies had went through this area already, and nothing happened. And now here come the command staff, which I was assigned to because I was still reading out some things that were going on with the photography. And all of a sudden, we got hit. We started firing back towards the area that we were getting hit from, and all of a sudden, an RPG went off right in front of us, me and this corporal. Just pushed me back, and I looked over the left side of his face. The left side of his face was just, there's nothing there hardly. And he fell back, and I knelt down and put his head on my shoulder, or on my knee, my right knee. I went totally deaf. I couldn't hear anything, but I know that I was screaming for a corpsman. And I looked at him, And there was other Marines around, and they were still firing, I guess, because like I said, I was deaf and I was paying attention. You know, we went through training, first aid training, stop the bleeding and clear the airway, and the face is red raised, you know, the face is red raised, the tail, face is tail, you know, all this kind of thing. How to put tourniquets on. But I never had any training on how to stop somebody bleeding in the face. I just was not there. The corpsman showed up. It seemed like a long time, but I know it was seconds. And he pulled the young corporal down, did some testing around his throat and stuff. And then he was on all four, and he just shook his head, because he was part of the staff. This corpsman was part of the battalion staff and knew this kid. And he was on all four, and he just shook his head. And I knew that this young corporal had he had passed away. And I had been hit in the hand. I still got 4 or 5 scars on this hand right here, in the spots. They called up a litter and covered him up, and they took this young corporal off. And I remember just sitting there, and I was I don't know how to tell you. I was just dazed. I don't know what was going on around me. It was like, I don't know how. Before I could start hearing again and seeing what was going on around me and getting my senses back of what was happening around me. I never had any, I mean, like I said, I saw a number of Marines that had been killed in body bags and stuff, but I never had one next to me. I mean, right there. That was probably one of the toughest days, because you always think about that. What this young man, even today, sacrifice that he made, and you know, he gave his life for something that he thought he was doing. He was from Massachusetts, if I remember right, and I don't remember if he had brothers and sisters. I know I talked to him a little bit. We talked a little bit, but you know, there's so many other things going on around you, and but I always remember that. I think about, you know, what happened to that young man and his mom and dad, and I don't know, again, like I said, I don't remember if he had brothers and sisters or what, but they, you know, he was gone. And it was just, boom, we were right back in action. I mean, the next thing I knew, you know, I wrapped up my hand with a bandage. I had a first aid pack. I took it off and wrapped up my right hand and went on. And I probably could have got a Purple Heart out of it. I don't know. I never, you know, at the time I was so, I would have been embarrassed to say anything, because this kid had lost his life. So, who am I to run up and say, oh, my hands hurt? I just couldn't do that to myself. I just could not, for some reason, I just could not do that. I remember we finished that operation, and I went back, and it got infected. I had to go to the first aid station back in Fubai, and they did put some stuff on it and whatever, and it healed up eventually. Of course, like I said, I still got the scars, but that was a tough day, and I didn't want to, you know, again, I was always, I don't want to say close to any of those people that I was assigned to, but, you know, you did talk to them, and of course, like I said, again, I was fortunate I could go back to the base, back to the battalion headquarters, battalion regimental headquarters, and then on back to division headquarters, and clean up and whatever, get ready for the next mission to go out. I eventually ended up going out on several of those missions, and no big major issue. We had a, you know, I was just a support person, if you will. I started not going out on the very first patrols and stuff, or out front in the lead squads. I got smarter to stay back if I could, and I briefed all these kids, the sergeants and whatever, and the lieutenants that were going out. I briefed them as best I could, and I let them go do their thing. I ended up in December of 1967, we got involved in Quezon. Quezon was a big siege on Quezon. Well, when Colonel Shepard left, a colonel by the name of Edward Miller come in. And one of the things would be in my 20-hour days, if I decided I needed to have an operation immediate photography for an operation, I would go ahead and write my request up, and I'd go and Colonel Shepard, I'd knock on his door, and he would sign, and I would take it over to the command center, the COC, and they would send it off to make it work. Well, Colonel Milner, he did not want that. So what he had me do one day, and this is one of the funny sides, he called me in and he wrote his name at the top of this piece of paper. It was like legal paper. And he said, "Write my name 100 times. I said, "Sir?" He said, "Write my name 100 times. So I wrote his name down 100 times. I mean, I wrote, on page after page, write his name. He says, "Okay." He said, "When you need an operation immediate message during the middle of the night," he said, "you sign my name and I'll back you up." I said, "Oh, okay, whatever works," because I also was running infrared photography stuff going up the Gulf of Tonkin, and they were doing what they call side-looking airborne radar. And what we were doing, we were depicting, and I had a station, a pickup station. If the NVA was coming down from the north, and some of it was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail or other trails, in vehicles and whatever, I could pick up these vehicles that were moving, because at the end of the day, when they stopped, that's when we would fly our mission, the side-looking airborne mission up the Gulf of Tonkin. Because the hoods of the vehicles would be hot, and that's what this infrared did. It picked up hot spots. Also, if there were fires where these guys were building their fires to cook their rice for their evening meal right after they stopped at night when it got dark, I could pick them up. Well, I could interpret off of there how many trucks meant, okay, X number of people maybe, and if they had X number of fires and they would build like a bonfire, to cook their rice in, okay, next number of people around this bonfire, there's 10 bonfires, how many people do you think may be there? So that was, significant to get those reports out immediately. I mean, I would read those things at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when they would come back by and download that for me. And then I needed to make some decisions. Well, anyhow, Colonel Miller, he didn't want nothing to do with that during the middle of the night. I could do whatever I wanted. So anyhow, I took advantage of it a few times and sent some messages out to cover my butt and to help the Marines, so that the Marines would know. And other people would know that there was an infantry unit or some type of unit coming south. And so I picked up several of those and had a chance to report them, which I felt pretty good about, that I was picking them up and had a chance to report them. But anyhow, that was another thing. But in December of 1967, I was sent into Colonel Miller, who said, "Okay, I want you to go into Quezon." And he said, "You can't do," he knew about that time and what I did and how I did it. So we built a box that I could read negatives off of. And it was a light box. And it was about, I don't know, maybe 2 foot, maybe 1.5 feet or so long, wide and long. And it had a glass on the top of it, and it had a 100-watt light bulb inside of it. And what I was doing then, I was requesting photography for Quezon, and the 7th Air Force would fly the mission, and they would come back the next day, and they would parachute out the negatives, and we'd have to go and pick up the negatives. Then I could read them off of this light box. I had the system of able to do that. Well, that worked fairly well. I mean, because I don't know if people remember the Quezon was going on. The NVA kept moving closer and closer to us, and we just had in our minds that they eventually were going to attack us. I mean, they were just going to all out, because we found some tanks, we found trucks, we found all kinds of different things on photography and other intel things that came into us, that these guys were serious about the siege on Quezon. So we kept building up our people. And it was on the 22nd of January of 1968, we got something like 1,800 rounds of mortar fire and artillery fire. It hit our base camp. We lost our ammo dump. The command center that I was in, under bunkers and stuff, got blown up, and I damaged my light table. I had a hard time reading anything off of that. The weather turned to crap, and anyhow, another story is that I had orders in my pocket to be out of Vietnam. I was supposed to have been out of there in the end of January of 1968, and because I had spent my 13 months there. But I couldn't get out because whenever an aircraft came in and landed, which is normally a C-123, a small C-130 type aircraft, would come in and land, they'd go into the runway, turn around, spin, throw everything out, supplies, and then if you had any wounded that you had to get on, you got on, and they were not on the ground probably 4 or 5 minutes at the most. Because as soon as that aircraft come in, the NDA would start bombing us with artillery and mortar rounds and everything else they had, because that aircraft was coming in. Well, one day I had a mission, and the 7th Air Force, one of the jets come by, popped out this parachute, and it floated over to the bad guy's side. Well, that was not good. It was supposed to be over my side, because the boys did a wind check and all that. So anyhow, somebody, I don't know who, made the decision that we ought to go out there and pick that up. Well, we was going to have to go out where the bad guys were. So I said, okay, I want to go along, because I knew what I was looking for. So I got a reinforced squad, and I think I had some lieutenant trying to tell us what we were supposed to be doing. And we went out there, and we went across the bad guy line, and we didn't get 100 yards, and we got it handed to us. I mean, it was just chaos. It was all over. The bad guys were there. This was in the latter part of January of, I think right around the 30th or so of January when this took place. Well, the corporal that was assigned to me, he was like, he's going to be my guardian. And he was going to take care of this old 23-year-old staff sergeant. Mm-hmm. He was a young kid, probably 18, 19 years old. But his job was to take care of this old staff sergeant. And he got hit. So they picked him up in another Marine. We got him back across the line, and we went up to where the first aid station was, and I think he had his shoulder and something else that was hit. So I stayed with him, and I went to the battalion commander, the regimental commander, and said, Colonel, nothing I can do anymore. I can't read. My light table's destroyed. I can't read it anymore. And I said, the weather. I said, my orders are in my pocket to get the hell out of here. So the colonel said, Staff Sergeant, go ahead and go. If you can get out the best way you can. Get out of here. So I'm in Quezon, and it's miles back to where the regimental, the battalion area is, because we had moved part of the 3rd Marine Division forward. So they were in Dong Ha, and it was quite a ways away. And I said, how am I going to get out of here? Well, I had to go corporal. And the next thing I knew, there was an aircraft at 123 coming in, and it was going to drop supplies because we had our ammo dump was blown up. Oh, that was a mess. It was another disaster, blowing up an ammo dump with all our ammo was in one spot. So we had to get more ammo, refurnish ourselves. So anyhow, this one came in. I had the young corporal. I put him over my shoulder, and when they spun around at the end of the runway and dropped all their supplies off, I got on with this young corporal, and my boots, with the blood of this young corporal, my combat boots are in a museum in Fort Worth. I picked him up, got him on there, and held on, and him and I got flown out of there, and we got into Fubai. And he got first aid, and I got off. I had to go back up to Dong Ha to check out, go through a process of, of leaving Vietnam and going through the colonel and getting all the right paperwork signed. Came back through, flew by, and on the 8th of February of 1968, I got out of Vietnam, and I left Vietnam. That was the end of my first tour. My second tour, I went back at the end of 1970, and I had been, at that time, I had went through counterintelligence school, and I was back as a counterintelligence officer, not a photo interpreter this time. And I did get assigned to Da Nang this time, right outside of Da Nang a little ways, in a compound with the 5th counterintelligence team. And anyhow, long story short, we ran operations out of there. What I did is, as a counterintelligence officer, I was a sub-team commander. And I got assigned to South Vietnamese interpreters. And they were two great guys. I mean, they spoke perfect English. They were in the South Vietnamese Army. They had issues of why they were as strong as they were against the NVA and the VC. So they did a lot of neat things. They supported me, and again, I went into a work mode, and I wanted to go out with. So what I do, I assigned myself to a battalion. I was going out for an operation to the west of Da Nang. I was an infantry battalion, and we would go out there with them. And I would take, my two sergeants and myself, and I had another staff sergeant by the name of Tennyson, who was in my sub-team. And we'd go out with the battalions that were going to do search and destroy the missions. And we would find the bad guys, and I would do interrogations. We would interrogate the bad guys to find out, where the unit was, how many was in the unit, where were they located, and all those kind of good things. But one of the problem was in the interrogation process, and I don't know if I should even say this because I could probably go to jail. I don't know. I hope the statute of limitations ran out, but I always had in my mind when I was doing interrogations, when you're doing operation interrogations in the field immediately, and there was things going on around you, you wanted to know where the bad guys were doing, and you wanted to save the life of a Marine. You were going to do whatever it needed to get information out of the bad guy. But one of the things that I come up with, this might not be the nicest, but you had you captured a guy and you were interrogating him, asking him where his unit was, and trying to just do general interrogation like you would normally do. But if things were so hectic, and you had him on the ground and you had a hold of him, I learned if you took your .45 and stuck it up between his legs and shot a round off with him laying on the ground, he would talk. He would tell you things that you wanted to know. It may not have been something I should have done. At the time, it never registered being a bad person. It was just, if I could find out how big these units were that was the Marines were coming into, where they were, about ammo, where supplies were, caches of weapons, I didn't care how I got the information. I truly didn't, because I felt I had an obligation to the Marines that I was with to do what I thought was right. And even though some of the commanders, company commanders and lieutenants and stuff knew that nobody asked a question, nobody said a word. But we got the information we needed. So I was doing that. I would attach myself to a battalion that was going out in an operation and take my two sergeants, and sometimes we would bring prisoners back, depending on the level of that prisoner, that POW, we would bring him back to our compound and we would interrogate him back there because we were trying to find out more additional information. If we found we had a sergeant or a lieutenant or somebody senior as a VC or an NVA, we want to spend more time with him in just a few questions on the ground and see what else that he might know. And we would go into the interrogation, and I would take one of my sergeants and tell him to go take a nap, and I'd keep one of my interrogators with me, and I'd make him stand in front of the desk, and we would interrogate him. You know, and it may take a day. I mean, we stayed on it. We didn't give him a break. I mean, eventually they came around, and they would talk. But one of the problems I had was that I had 48 hours to have him give me information, or if I picked up a civilian and it was interrogating a civilian that we thought was providing information, what was going on in Da Nang, people were coming in. Da Nang was a good-sized city, and they were gathering intelligence information on the South Vietnamese Army and the Marines and the Navy guys at the post, at the port, and what was going on at the airport. They would collect all this information, and they would take it back out, and they would either go by bus, or they'd ride a bike, or some way they'd get out to where the bad guys were in the western part of the state and say, okay, you know, they got a couple new ships coming in, or, you know, the Marines are doing this type of operation, and they would pass on that intel to the bad guys. Well, we were trying to stop that. So we would pick up a civilian who was a commo liaison guy. He was, you know, a communication person. And he would go and he would pick up, he would drive all over, or walk, or bicycle all over Da Nang and pick up bits and pieces of information, and then he would take off and try to get it back to the bad guys out in the western part of Vietnam. Anyhow, long story short, that was one of our tricks of trying to stop. When we would get a civilian that was doing that, I had 48 hours to have him tell me that he was doing that job. We may suspect, but we, you know, sometimes we didn't know. And this is back in the days when it wasn't computers; it was all paperwork. You know, 3x5 cards. And you know, I did a program with the CIA, Operation Phoenix, and they would provide me some information. Some of their guys would pick up that somebody was out there passing on kind of information, and they would say, okay, you know, go ahead. You know, I was a lieutenant at the time. No, I was a warrant officer. Okay, go ahead and get that guy, bring him in, and talk to him if you want, and let us know what he says. Well, in 48 hours, if I couldn't break him, I had to turn him over to what we called the PIC, the Prison Interrogation Center, which was in Da Nang. And that was a place that you did not want to go as a bad guy. You know, if you were an NBA or a VC guy, you didn't want to go there because the colonel who ran that was a sadist. He didn't like anybody. And the only reason he liked me, I used to take him bottles of Johnny Walker Red Label Scotch. And so he was my buddy. He liked me. I could go in there whenever. But if I had to take a prisoner down there, one day my driver and I got lost, and we ended up behind the PIC Center. And there was a lot of graves out there behind the PIC Center. It told me that a lot of these guys never got out of there. I mean, he was, I don't know, maybe I was wrong, but anyhow, it was one of those things that came across my mind that I said, oh my goodness, if I turn somebody in there, you know, they may never come out of there again, or obviously they're not coming out of there again. So anyhow, but I spent time in these operations, and we would gather a lot of information and bring it back, and we'd pass it on to all the services, not just the Marines. I worked, like I said, I worked with Operation Phoenix with the CIA guys, got to know them well, and we would work back and forth with different programs that we were running. We were doing a lot of what we called snatch and grab operations. 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, we would go and break down somebody's door, and we would get the guy out of there that we were looking for and take him back, and I would do the interrogations. But in order for us to do that, we always had to have a Vietnamese policeman with us to make this arrest, if you want to call it an arrest. But what we would do, we would bring, and we always ended up almost with the same guy because he spoke English. And we would bring him in, and we would feed him and get him half drunk and let him kind of pass out in a way, and then put him in the back of the Jeep. He had to be with us. That was legal. As long as, I don't care if he was sober or not, as long as he was there, and he was with us, we were legal. And then we would go out with a team, and we would break, like I said, break down the door and snatch up the guy, or in one case we had to snatch up a female, and we come back and we could interrogate, and we were illegal, we were above board, but we had to do it that way. And but we found out a lot of information within the interrogations and working with other units, particularly with the agency again, with the CIA guys again, because they have a lot of intel, a lot of things going on out there that we had no idea. You know, they were way ahead of us, and some technical things, and recruiting people and send them out there. But anyhow, that was my second tour, and what happened was in June of 1971, I got notified that they were going to pull me out early and send me to Iwakuni, Japan. And the whole purpose behind that is that when I got to Iwakuni, Japan, I started writing initial briefing procedures for our POWs that were going to get released from North Vietnam. And they wanted to know what we were going to do. We only had maybe 5 minutes, maybe, with a POW, that was coming back. He may be sick. We didn't know what condition our POWs were in. How many Marine POWs there were, we didn't know. There was no intel coming out of North Vietnam on these people. So I was locked in this room, and I wrote up these procedures and what equipment was needed, whatever, when they come in, because they come into Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, which is no longer. It got blown away by a volcano some years ago. And so I coordinated with the people down in the Philippines. I made some trips down there, knew what kind of equipment we were going to need, tape recorders, whatever. If we had the opportunity to sit down with a Marine POW, and what we were going to ask. And our biggest concern, what I finally figured out, I don't know why, but somehow I figured out that we wanted to know the names of all the POWs they knew and those who may have been missing in action. Because, we had a lot of people shot down that we never know what happened to them. So, but these guys may have seen them at one time or the other, or they may have seen them and they disappeared. We never saw them again. But some of these guys may have seen some of these people, knew some of these people, had the names of some of these people, or a list of people. So that's what we wanted to spend. That was the only thing we were concerned about in the very initial debriefing. So that was another story away from Vietnam, but it was associated with Vietnam because later on I got into detailed debriefing of POWs when they come back, and it was involved in 4 Marine POWs that came back, and I was at St. Albans Hospital in New York, and got deeply involved in that, and spent about 18 months of my life doing nothing but POW interviews and write-ups, and et cetera, what was happening with the POWs. But anyhow, that was my 2 tours in Vietnam. I don't know what else you want.
Well, this is just an honor to have allowed, for you to allow me to be here, and thank you for your service. And I want to give you an opportunity now, if there's anything that you want to add that you did not up to this point, and if you can give some wisdom to future generations, what would be your thoughts to give to them?
One of the things that and you're going to hear this, and I'm sure you'll hear it from others, that what you see, you can't unsee. And so that's always going to stick with you. So people, the younger generation coming up, have to realize that.
This will be the part 2 of the continued interview with Major Barry Marsh. So, Barry, will you share the rest of your story with us?
Yes, I'd like to. It's a story about one of the things our counterintelligence team did, the 5th counterintelligence team when we were in Da Nang on my second tour. We went down and got involved in a Catholic orphanage who took care of Vietnamese children who their parents were not around, and other things, different things happened to them. And the orphanage was run by the Catholics, and it was poor. So we took it on as a project, our team did, and we went down and we fixed windows and we fixed screens and doors, and we took a lot of food down. We used to be able to bargain for food, and we would scoff up a bunch of food, and we would take it down and give it to the orphanage so they could feed the children. Well, one of our sub-team commanders of the counterintelligence team wanted to adopt this one little Vietnamese girl. So they started the process. It was a really, unbelievable process that he had to go through. And I think there was some political polls here and there and whatever and that to make this happen. But the funny part is that when we ended up with the young girl, she was, I think, probably 2 years old, maybe 3 years old at the most at the time, back at our compound, when we were getting ready as sub-team commanders and sub-teams to go out and do operations with our combat battalions, somebody had to stay back and babysit because we couldn't leave this little girl all by herself. So we would take turns on who was going to stay back and babysit the baby while everybody else went out and did combat operations. But anyhow, eventually he did end up adopting the little girl, and they lived in California, and everything was fine. But it was just one of those things that we got ourselves into with the orphanage, and we were pretty proud of it, a bunch of us, that we were doing so much for these young little kids, and the sisters were so grateful because we did, like I said, we were able to trade off. When we went out and did the combat operations, we would come up with weapons and different things that were North Vietnamese or VC stuff, and we would bring it back after our operation. And then in Da Nang was the distribution center for the Army supplies. Well, there was 2 old master sergeants, Army master sergeants, who ran that, and this was steaks and chicken and shrimp and fish, all kinds of food. Unbelievable amount of food that they had for distribution to the Army people. Well, we'd go down there and trade them. We would give them a pistol or maybe a rifle or a BC flag or something, and we could just back our truck up and load it up with whatever we wanted. Well, a good portion of it ended up in that orphanage, so that they had plenty of food. So anyhow, we tried to take care of it the best we could. The other question you asked me at the end of the last go-around was what I would say to younger people today, people who have never been involved. I can tell you my experience was an eye-opener getting involved in combat. What I ran up against, what I started to feel about certain things happening. And one of the things that I've taken away from all that is trying to treat people the way that you want to be treated. That's an old thing that's been out there for many, many, many years, but I always felt that no matter what we were up against, and even when we were doing interrogations and being in a hostile situation, we knew that that person across from us was a human being, and he had feelings and family and stuff, just like we did. So even though we were harsh sometimes to get things done, we always had to look back and say, how do we want to be done? How we want to be treated? And even though we don't have the same likes and dislikes with a lot of people, and we, are different parts of the country, different things happen, you still have to look at different perspectives. You've got to keep that always in mind. I think always trying to keep in perspective of what different people are, what they mean, to other folks. And you try sometime, I don't want to use the right word, I don't know if that's the right word, look at the other side, but you just have to step back, step a little bit sometime, and realize what you're up against and what you're doing. So anyhow, that's my story.
Again, then, Major Marsh, thank you for your service,
You're
and
welcome.
we appreciate your being here today.
Thank you.